In the autumn of the year 1751, in a quiet market town in the west of England called Thornbury, there lived a printer's apprentice named Thomas Hartley. Thornbury was no great city like London or Bath. It had no grand cathedral, no fashionable assembly rooms, no crowds of carriages rattling over paved streets. It was instead a modest place of gray stone houses and thatched roofs, where the church bell marked the hours of the day and the smell of wood smoke hung over the rooftops on cold mornings. It had its weekly market, its coaching inn where travelers paused on their way to somewhere grander, its small gray church with a crooked steeple, and a printing shop that served the whole county with pamphlets, notices, and the occasional slim book of sermons for the local clergy. Thomas had come to that shop at the age of 12, the son of a weaver who had died of a fever 2 winters before, leaving behind a widow and 3 young children with little more than a loom, a few coins, and a great deal of grief. His mother, a washerwoman named Margaret, had struggled to feed her children alone, taking in the linens of wealthier families and scrubbing them raw-handed in cold water from dawn until well past dark. It was a hard, joyless labor that bent her back and cracked her knuckles, and still there were nights when the children went to bed with less in their stomachs than they should have had. It was in this season of hardship that the printer, a stern but fair man named Josiah Fenwick, came to hear of the widow Hartley and her clever, quiet son who was said to have a good hand for letters, having been taught his alphabet by the parish curate. Fenwick, who had no children of his own and no apprentice at the time, offered to take Thomas into his shop without the usual fee that families were expected to pay for such an arrangement. When Margaret heard this offer, she wept with gratitude right there on the shop's worn wooden doorstep, for it meant one less mouth to feed at home, and more than that, it meant a future for her son beyond the washtub and the workhouse that so often awaited fatherless boys in those days. Fenwick was known throughout Thornbury as an honest tradesman, though a hard and exacting one. He charged a fair price for his printing work, and never a farthing more, even when a customer might not have known the difference, and he expected precisely the same standard from everyone who worked beneath his roof. On Thomas's very first morning in the shop, standing amid the smell of ink and paper and the great creaking press that dominated the back room, Fenwick looked the boy up and down and said to him in a voice that brooked no argument, "Boy, I care not whether you are clever with your letters or clumsy with the press. Both of those things can be taught, given time and patience. What I care about, and what cannot be taught if it is not already in your heart, is this: never lie to me, never cheat a customer, and never take what is not yours, not even so much as a single pin from my workbench. Break that rule once, just once, and you are out of my house before the church bell rings noon, and I shall not hear a single word of excuse." Thomas took those words to heart, and not merely out of fear of losing his position, welcome as it was. He remembered something his own father had told him many months before, as he lay dying of the fever that would take him. His father, weak and pale against the bed linens, had held his son's hand and said, in a voice already growing faint, that a poor man may lose his coat, may lose his supper, may even lose his good name through no fault of his own, through misfortune or the malice of others. But he need never lose his honesty, for that is the one possession entirely within his own keeping, the one thing that no landlord, no thief, no illness, and no cruel turn of fortune can ever take from him unless he chooses to give it away himself. Thomas, young as he was, had held on to those words as tightly as he held his father's hand that final night, and he resolved that whatever else life might strip from him in the years to come, it would never take his word. The test of that resolve, though he did not know it then, came sooner than he expected, and it came in a manner so ordinary that he might easily have overlooked its importance. One bitter January morning, some months into his apprenticeship, a farmer's wife named Mrs. Alcott came bustling into the shop to collect a set of handbills that had been printed advertising an upcoming horse fair some miles distant. She was in a great hurry, for the day was cold and gray and threatening snow, and her cart stood waiting outside with the horse stamping impatiently and blowing clouds of steam into the freezing air. She pressed a small leather purse of coins into Thomas's hand, telling him hurriedly to take what was owed for the printing and to keep whatever remained against her next visit, as she often ordered handbills and did not wish to be troubled with exact counting on so cold and busy a morning. Thomas, ever careful with such matters as Fenwick had trained him to be, counted out the correct sum with care, which came to 12 shillings for the quantity and quality of paper she had ordered, and he set the purse aside upon the counter, intending to call her back and return what remained before she departed. But Mrs. Alcock, true to her hurry, had already climbed up onto her cart and was rattling away down the cobbled street, her horse's hoofs striking sparks against the frozen stones, before Thomas could so much as step out from behind the counter to call after her. When he opened the purse again to be certain of his own counting, his heart gave a small, uncomfortable lurch, for he discovered that Mrs. Alcock had, in her haste and distraction, given him not merely the sum owed, but 10 shillings more besides, a whole crown and a half, coins that in his family's circumstances represented a fortune beyond anything they had seen since his father's death. No one had witnessed the mistake. The shop stood empty of other customers at that hour, and Fenwick himself was occupied in the back room, setting type for a sermon with his sleeves rolled up and his spectacles pushed low upon his nose, quite unaware of what had passed at the counter. Thomas stood alone with the coins resting heavy and warm in his palm, and for one long, aching moment, temptation whispered to him with a voice that sounded almost reasonable. He thought of his mother's hands, cracked and bleeding at the knuckles from washing other people's linens in water, so cold it numbed her fingers to the bone. He thought of his little sister, barely 7 years old, whose shoes had worn through at the soles that very winter, so that she wrapped her feet in rags to walk to church on Sundays. 10 shillings was no small thing to a family such as his. It could buy coal for a fortnight, bread and butter enough that no one need go hungry, perhaps even a new pair of shoes for his sister before the worst of the cold set in. But even as these thoughts moved through his mind, Thomas found that his father's words rose up beside them, quiet but immovable, and he understood with a clarity that surprised even himself that he could not keep money that was not his, however great his family's need. For the need of today does not erase the wrong of tomorrow, and a wrong done quietly is still a wrong, whether or not another soul on this earth ever comes to know of it. He asked the shop boy who swept the floors to mind the counter in his absence, and though it was a full 3 miles to the Alcock farm along roads that were by now half frozen and treacherous with ice, he set out walking that very afternoon, without so much as stopping for his midday meal, determined to return the money before the day was done. He arrived at the farmhouse well after 2 hours of walking, breathless, half frozen through his thin coat, his fingers stiff and aching with cold, and knocked upon the farmhouse door with hands he could scarcely feel. When Mrs. Alcock opened the door and saw the boy from the print shop standing shivering on her step, she could scarcely believe what he had come to tell her. She had not even noticed the error in her own haste that morning, and when Thomas explained what had happened and pressed the extra coins back into her hand, she stood for a moment in genuine astonishment, looking at the boy as though seeing him for the first time. She was so moved by his honesty, particularly given how plainly cold and tired he was from the long walk, that she insisted he come in and warm himself by her fire, and send him home afterward with a fresh loaf of bread still warm from her oven and a good wedge of cheese wrapped in cloth, refusing to let him leave without them. Thomas walked home in the gathering dark, cold to the very bone, his legs aching from the long journey there and back. But there was a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the loaf tucked beneath his arm. When he reached the shop and told Fenwick what had happened, the old printer set down his composing stick and said nothing for a long while, merely looking at the boy over the rims of his spectacles with an expression Thomas could not quite read. At last Fenwick said only, "You'll do well here, boy," in a voice gruffer than usual, but Thomas could tell, from the way the old man's eyes softened just slightly, that he was well pleased indeed. Word of the small act of honesty spread slowly through the town, as such stories do in places where everyone knows everyone else's business, carried from kitchen to kitchen and inn by those who had heard it from Mrs. Alcock herself, until eventually it reached the ears of a wealthy wool merchant named Edmund Radcliffe, a man who supplied fine cloth to buyers as far away as Bristol and had grown considerably rich through decades of shrewd trade. Radcliffe was not a cruel man, but he was a hard and suspicious one, for he had learned across many years of business dealings that most men, given sufficient opportunity and sufficient reward, could be persuaded to bend their principles, and he did not entirely believe the tales he heard of an apprentice boy who would walk 3 miles through frozen roads merely to return coins that were not his own. Being a man who trusted little that he had not tested with his own eyes, Radcliffe devised a means of proving the boy either honest or merely fortunate in his reputation. He disguised himself in the plain, rough coat of a common drover, the sort of traveling cattle merchant who might pass through Thornbury on market days, and visited the print shop under this false appearance to order a small notice advertising a fictitious sale of wool. When Thomas totaled the modest bill, and Radcliffe reached into his coat to pay, the merchant deliberately let a gold guinea coin slip from his fingers and roll beneath the counter, out of sight, pretending not to notice its absence as he continued counting out the remaining coins from his purse. Thomas, whose eyes missed little in the running of the shop, saw the coin fall and roll into the shadows beneath the counter. He bent at once, retrieved it, and held it out to the disguised merchant without hesitation. "Sir, you've dropped a guinea," he said simply, and Radcliffe took it back with a murmur of thanks, careful to keep his expression unreadable, though inwardly he was already reconsidering his skepticism. Yet Radcliffe was not a man easily satisfied, and he reasoned that perhaps the boy had simply feared being seen too plainly, given that the coin had fallen in the middle of the shop where anyone might have glanced over. A week later, he sent one of his own servants to the print shop bearing a small parcel of coins and a carefully worded false message, claiming that Fenwick's account with a certain Bristol wool house had recently been settled, and that in the settlement a small additional payment had been set aside specifically as a reward for the apprentice's trouble in some earlier errand, though in truth no such transaction, no such account, and no such reward had ever existed. It was, in every particular, an invented tale designed to see whether Thomas would accept unearned coin without questioning its origin. Thomas found the servant's message strange from the moment he heard it, for Fenwick had said nothing to him of any dealings with a Bristol wool house, nor of any payment owed to himself for services rendered. Rather than simply pocket the coins and count himself fortunate, as many boys in his position might have done without a second thought, he carried the purse straight to Fenwick and asked plainly what the message could mean, for he did not wish to accept money under circumstances he did not understand. Fenwick, equally puzzled, made his own inquiries among his usual business contacts, and soon discovered that no such transaction had ever taken place with any Bristol wool house. The coins were returned to the servant with a polite but firm explanation, and it was only some time later, through the idle talk of a servant who enjoyed gossip more than discretion, that the truth of the matter came to light. It had all been a deliberate trial arranged by Mr. Radcliffe himself, designed to test whether the boy's honesty was genuine, or merely a story that had grown taller with each retelling through the town. When his second attempt to catch the boy in dishonesty failed just as thoroughly as the first, Radcliffe's stubborn skepticism began, slowly and against his own inclination, to give way to something closer to genuine curiosity and even a grudging admiration. Radcliffe resolved that he would test the boy once more, though this time with something of considerably greater weight than a dropped coin, or a purse of invented reward money. He sent word to Fenwick, through a note carried by his own coachman, requesting that the apprentice be spared for several weeks to assist at his counting-house with a review of certain accounts concerning wool purchases from the many farms across the surrounding countryside, offering fair payment for the boy's time and trouble. Fenwick, who valued Radcliffe's custom highly, and saw no reason to refuse so respected a merchant, agreed to the arrangement, and Margaret Hartley, though not without some anxious hesitation about her son working within so grand and unfamiliar a household, gave her blessing readily enough once she learned that the wages offered would be sufficient to buy new boots for all three of her children before the worst of the winter set in. At the counting-house, a handsome stone building attached to Radcliffe's manor and filled with tall shelves of ledgers bound in leather, Thomas was set to work under the direction of the merchant's chief clerk, a nervous, sharp-featured man named Mr. Price, who had served in that position for some 11 years and was generally regarded, at least on the surface, as competent and reliable. What no one yet knew, save Price himself, was that for several of those years he had been quietly and carefully falsifying certain entries in the ledgers, recording prices paid to farmers that were somewhat higher than what had actually changed hands, and pocketing the difference for himself in small amounts that, taken individually, seemed unlikely to draw notice, but which over time had accumulated into a very considerable sum. Radcliffe had long harbored some vague suspicion that his accounts did not entirely add up as they ought, but Price was careful, methodical, and clever in his deceptions, and the merchant had never been able to point to any single discrepancy sufficient to prove wrongdoing. Thomas, set to the tedious but important work of checking sums against receipts and comparing recorded purchases against the actual wool delivered, soon began to notice troubling inconsistencies that a less careful eye might easily have overlooked. Certain farms, according to the ledgers, had sold quantities of wool that seemed impossibly large given what Thomas knew from his own observations and from casual conversation with local farmhands those particular farms actually produced in a season. Other entries recorded prices that did not match at all with what neighboring farmers, when asked in passing, said they had actually received for their wool that year. Slowly, patiently, over the course of several days, Thomas began compiling his own careful notes on these discrepancies, uncertain yet what they meant but troubled by the pattern he was beginning to see. When Price came to realize that this new boy's unexpectedly careful eye was steadily uncovering the very fraud he had spent years concealing, fear began to gnaw at him with increasing urgency. One evening, after the other clerks had gone home and the counting-house stood empty save for the two of them, Price approached Thomas and, glancing nervously toward the door, pressed a small leather purse into the boy's hands. "Take this," Price said, his voice low and urgent, almost pleading, "and simply tell Mr. Radcliffe that all is in good order, that you have found nothing amiss in the accounts. You are young, Thomas. You have your whole life ahead of you, and this need cost you nothing at all. Why should you trouble yourself over an old clerk's small comforts, accumulated honestly enough through years of faithful service? I have a wife and 4 children who depend entirely upon this position for their bread. If the truth of this matter comes fully to light, I shall be ruined utterly, perhaps imprisoned, and my family will be left to starve or beg upon the parish." Thomas felt the considerable weight of the purse in his hand, and felt too the weight of the man's genuine fear and desperation in his trembling voice, and for one long, difficult moment his heart was truly torn between two sympathies. He was, after all, but a boy of 14, standing alone in a quiet counting-house holding in his 2 hands both a small fortune and the power to ruin another man's entire family. But he thought again of his father's dying words, of Fenwick's stern warning on his very first day, of the coins he had carried 3 frozen miles rather than keep them, and he understood with quiet certainty that if he accepted this bribe today, whatever his sympathy for Price's family, he would have no honest ground left to stand upon ever again, not tomorrow, not for the rest of his life. "I am truly sorry for your family's sake, sir," Thomas said gently, pressing the purse back into Price's own trembling hands, "and I do not wish to see your wife and children suffer for what you have done. But I cannot lie in the ledgers, not for you, not for anyone, whatever the cost to myself or to others. I will speak to Mr. Radcliffe on your behalf when the time comes, and ask him most earnestly for whatever mercy he might be willing to show you, but I will not hide the truth of what I have found." Price left the room that evening in evident shame, his shoulders bowed, and Thomas himself slept poorly that night, deeply troubled by the knowledge of what must inevitably come next, and by no means certain how it would end. Terrified now beyond reason of the exposure he saw fast approaching, Price resolved upon a far darker course of action than mere bribery. Late one night, when the household had retired and all was quiet, he slipped stealthily into the small room where Thomas kept his coat and his few modest belongings during his stay at the counting-house, and there he hid, folded carefully within the boy's spare shirt, a small silver locket, a cherished keepsake that had belonged to Radcliffe's own late wife, which had gone missing from the manor's parlor some days before under circumstances that had already caused considerable distress and confusion throughout the household. The following morning, when the locket's absence was formally discovered and reported to Radcliffe himself, Price, feigning shock and sorrow with practiced skill, suggested quietly to the assembled household that perhaps a thorough search ought to be made, observing with careful casualness that one could never entirely know the true character of those recently brought into so great a house, particularly strangers of humble origin, unfamiliar to the long-serving staff. His meaning, though never spoken outright, was plain enough to everyone present, and suspicion turned at once, and with considerable force, toward the humble apprentice from the print shop, a boy who was, after all, a newcomer among servants who had known one another and served the family for many years. Radcliffe, though he had come by this point to hold a genuine, if still cautious, respect for the boy through the trials he himself had arranged, could not simply ignore so serious a matter, particularly one touching so directly upon the treasured memory of his own late wife, and he reluctantly ordered that a search be made of the household, including the rooms and belongings of all recent arrivals. To the visible horror and murmured dismay of everyone gathered in that moment, the silver locket was discovered exactly where Price had hidden it, folded within Thomas's own spare shirt. The housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Bickford, who had served the family for over 20 years, cried out at once in evident anger and vindication, declaring loudly that she had always known no good could possibly come of bringing some common tradesman's boy into a gentleman's respectable household, whatever fine tales were told of his supposed honesty. Thomas stood pale and visibly trembling before the assembled household, understanding in that terrible moment, for the very first time in his young life, the crushing weight of a false accusation, for though he was entirely innocent of any wrongdoing, he could offer no proof of his innocence beyond his own simple word, and it was precisely that word which now stood so gravely in question before every eye in the room. "Sir," Thomas said at last, his voice shaking badly but growing steadier with each word, "I swear before God and all that is holy that I have never so much as touched that locket, nor anything else in this house that was not rightfully mine to touch. I cannot explain how it came to be among my things, but I did not put it there, and I beg you to believe me." Radcliffe studied the boy's stricken face for a long, silent moment, his own thoughts churning as he recalled, one after another, the coins returned after a 3-mile walk through winter frost, the honest confusion over an invented reward, the troubled but truthful confession regarding the ledgers only days before. Something deep within him resisted entirely what the evidence of his own eyes seemed so plainly to declare, even as his reasoning mind told him the matter appeared on its face quite settled beyond dispute. And so, against the urging of several in his household who wished the matter dealt with swiftly and severely, Radcliffe determined that he would not act in haste. Rather than summon the parish constable at once, as many in his position might have done without further thought, Radcliffe chose instead to question each member of his household privately and individually over the following days, paying particularly close attention to anyone who had shown unusual displeasure, nervousness, or discomfort in the time since Thomas's arrival. and especially to anyone who might stand to lose a great deal should the ledgers Thomas had been examining be fully and properly reviewed. To draw the true culprit into carelessness, Ratcliffe announced publicly to the entire household that, since the locket itself had now been recovered, he considered the difficult matter closed, and that out of Christian charity he was prepared to pardon the boy of any further suspicion, the whole unfortunate affair now behind them. Privately, however, he instructed a footman, whose discretion he trusted absolutely, to remain watchful and to listen closely to whatever conversation might pass in the servants' hall in the days that followed. Relieved beyond measure that the danger to himself now seemed entirely to have passed, Price grew careless in his relief, as guilty men so often do once they believe themselves safe. That very evening, seated over his modest supper in the kitchen with a fellow clerk he considered a friend, he began to boast quietly, thinking himself unheard, of how cleverly he had solved his troublesome little problem with the boy from the print shop, laughing under his breath that a small silver trinket had proven a very cheap price indeed to pay for removing so inconveniently sharp an eye from his precious accounts. The footman, standing unnoticed nearby with a tray of dishes, carried these damning words directly to Ratcliffe before the hour was out. Furious at what he now understood to be a deliberate and calculated deception practiced against an innocent boy, Ratcliffe summoned Price to his study that very night and confronted him directly, and without warning with what had been overheard in the kitchen. Price, caught entirely off guard, at first attempted to deny everything with increasingly feeble protests, but when told plainly and precisely that his own boastful words had been witnessed and reported, his composure broke entirely, and he confessed through tears both to planting the locket among Thomas's belongings and, in the same desperate breath, to years of steadily falsifying the wool accounts for his own private profit. Ratcliffe called the entire household together the following morning, and before them all, declared Thomas Hartley wholly and completely innocent of any wrongdoing whatsoever, offering the boy a formal apology for the grave suspicion so unjustly cast upon him. Mrs. Bickford, so quick to condemn only days before, flushed deeply with shame at her own hasty words and murmured her own quiet apology to the boy she had so readily accused. Ratcliffe's first intention, once the full truth had come to light, was to see Price arrested and prosecuted to the fullest extent the law allowed, for theft and the deliberate framing of an innocent boy were grave crimes indeed, deserving of the harshest available punishment. But before the parish constable could be sent for, Thomas stepped forward with a request that took everyone in the room entirely by surprise. "Sir," he said, addressing Ratcliffe directly before the assembled household, "Mr. Price has wronged me most gravely, and he has wronged you far longer still through his years of dishonest accounts. He deserves punishment for what he has done, and I will not pretend otherwise, nor ask that his crimes go entirely unanswered. But I ask that you consider mercy alongside justice in what you decide. He spoke to me himself, before any of this came to light, of a wife and 4 young children who know absolutely nothing of his wrongdoing, and who will suffer terribly, and through no fault of their own, if he is sent to prison or worse. Let him lose his position here entirely, let him repay from whatever wages and property he holds whatever portion of what he has stolen that can be recovered, but I beg you most earnestly not to see his innocent family utterly ruined for his sins alone." Ratcliffe stared at the boy in open astonishment, scarcely able to credit what he was hearing. "You would ask mercy," he said slowly, "for the very man who conspired to see you hanged as a common thief?" "I would, sir," Thomas replied steadily, meeting the merchant's gaze without flinching. "Anger is easy enough to come by. Any man might wish harm upon one who has done him harm in turn, and none would think it strange. But if I asked you for nothing at all but his complete ruin, I fear I should become little better myself than he was when he sought mine." After a long period of careful thought, weighing the demands of justice against the boy's unexpected plea for mercy, Ratcliffe agreed at last to a compromise. Price was dismissed from his position in considerable disgrace, and the greater part of his remaining wages and modest savings were seized to repay whatever portion could be recovered of what he had stolen over so many years. But he was spared the prison sentence and the public trial he had every reason to fear, on the strict condition that he leave Thornbury entirely and permanently, and never again seek or hold any position of financial trust for the remainder of his days. Price, humble beyond words and profoundly grateful for an outcome considerably kinder than anything he had believed himself to deserve, gathered his family and departed for a distant county, where it was later said, through occasional word that reached back to Thornbury over the years, that he lived out the remainder of his life as an honest and hard-working farm laborer, never again tempted by another man's ledger or another man's coin. Some years passed, and Thomas grew from a boy of 14 into a capable and steady young man of 18, having by this time risen to become Radcliffe's most trusted clerk, entrusted with responsibilities far beyond what his humble origins might once have suggested. It was in this period that a terrible harvest failure struck the entire county, a disaster that would test Thomas's principles in ways quite different from anything he had yet faced. An unusually dry summer withered the wheat and barley in the fields long before they could properly ripen, and by the following winter the price of bread had climbed to such extraordinary heights that many poor families throughout the county, families not unlike Thomas's own not so many years before, found themselves facing genuine hunger for the first time in living memory. Several merchants across the region, seeing in this misfortune an opportunity for considerable profit, began quietly hoarding whatever stores of grain they held, calculating that if they simply waited long enough, prices would climb even higher still before they need sell a single sack, and several of these merchants, colleagues and rivals of Radcliffe alike, urged him strongly to do precisely the same with the grain he himself held in reserve that year, arguing that any man of business would be a fool to sell cheap when he might so easily sell dear. Thomas brought this troubling matter directly to his employer without hesitation. "Sir," he said, "I know full well it is not ordinarily my place to question how you conduct your business, and I hope you will forgive me for speaking so plainly. But I cannot in good conscience help arrange the withholding of grain while children in this very town, children I have known and watched grow up, go without bread through no fault of their own. Whatever profit such hoarding might eventually bring us, it would be built entirely upon the suffering of our own neighbors, and I do not believe such profit could ever sit easily upon any honest conscience." Radcliffe, remembering now all he had come to learn of this young man's character over the years of trials and tests he himself had once devised, did not dismiss the concern as mere youthful sentiment, as he might once have done. Instead, after some consideration, he ordered his own grain sold at a fair and steady price rather than held back for greater profit, and set aside a further portion to be distributed entirely free of charge among the poorest families of the parish. Thomas himself oversaw this distribution personally, taking great care to determine each family's true and honest need before any grain was given, so that no household went without what it required, and no family, through exaggeration or greed, took more than its fair and honest share. Throughout that hard and bitter winter, it was said afterward with considerable pride throughout Thornbury that no family in the entire parish went truly hungry who had not first received aid from Radcliffe's own stores, thanks in no small measure to the careful and honest young clerk who had refused, at some risk to his own position, to let profit come before conscience. Thomas's growing reputation for scrupulous honesty and careful judgment eventually traveled well beyond the boundaries of Thornbury itself, carried by traveling merchants and local gentry alike who had witnessed or heard tell of his conduct. In time it reached the ears of a county magistrate, a man greatly troubled by persistent and mounting reports of corruption among certain tax collectors and toll officials across the region, men who were widely suspected of quietly pocketing public funds that had been collected specifically for the maintenance and repair of the county's roads and bridges, funds that seemed never quite to translate into the actual repairs, so badly needed. The magistrate, having grown thoroughly weary of corrupt officials who covered their tracks with practiced skill, sought urgently for a clerk of truly unimpeachable character to examine the county's tangled records and determine, once and for all, where precisely the missing money had gone. Radcliffe, asked directly for his recommendation, did not hesitate to put forward young Thomas Hartley for the difficult task, and though it was highly unusual by the standards of the day for so young a man of such humble birth to be entrusted with matters of such consequence and delicacy, the magistrate, sufficiently desperate for a trustworthy eye amid so much suspected corruption, agreed readily enough to the unconventional arrangement. Thomas traveled to the county town at the magistrate's request, and began there the long, painstaking, and often tedious work of comparing years of tax records against the actual repairs supposedly carried out, toll receipts against the observable traffic upon the roads in question, and wages recorded as paid against the actual work that had genuinely been performed. Slowly, methodically, over many weeks of careful and exhausting labor, he began to uncover a clear and troubling pattern of deliberate fraud spread across several officials and several years, repairs recorded in official ledgers that had, upon careful inquiry, quite plainly never been made at all, tolls collected in significant sums from travelers upon the roads, but never properly reported to the county treasury, wages paid, according to the records, to laborers who upon investigation appeared not to exist at all, their supposed earnings simply vanishing into the private pockets of the officials responsible for the accounts. This important but dangerous discovery placed Thomas in genuine peril, for the men responsible for these frauds held considerable local power and influence, and were by no means inclined to surrender their ill-gotten gains quietly or without a fight. Thomas soon began receiving anonymous letters, crudely written but unmistakably threatening, warning him in the strongest possible terms to abandon his inquiries at once or else see real and lasting harm come to himself and to his family back in Thornbury. Frightened though he genuinely was by these threats, Thomas did not waver in his resolve, and brought the letters straight to the magistrate himself rather than concealing his fear or acting alone. The magistrate, taking the threats with proper seriousness, provided the young man with protection and pressed the difficult investigation forward with renewed and determined urgency. With Thomas's careful and thoroughly documented evidence finally in hand, the corrupt officials responsible were at last brought before the county court to answer for their years of deception. The case presented against them was so meticulously assembled and so clearly demonstrated that the accused men could offer little meaningful defense against it. Several were dismissed from their positions entirely and ordered to repay whatever portion of the stolen funds could still be recovered from their own property. The worst and most flagrant offenders among them faced criminal imprisonment for their crimes. The magistrate, acting upon Thomas's own thoughtful suggestion, used a substantial portion of the recovered money to establish a small charitable fund intended specifically for the widows and orphans of laborers who had been injured, sometimes fatally, in accidents upon the county's poorly maintained roads that had gone so long without proper repair precisely because the funds meant for their upkeep had been so thoroughly and systematically stolen. When the grateful magistrate offered Thomas both a substantial monetary reward and the offer of a permanent, well-paid position within the county's administration, Thomas requested instead, to the considerable surprise of everyone present, that the greater part of any reward be directed toward establishing a small school back in Thornbury, a place where poor children, whether boys or girls alike, might learn to read, to write, and to properly reckon sums, so that they might grow up far less easily cheated in their own future dealings, and so that some among them might, in time, come to serve their own community with the same honesty he had striven all his life to practice himself. Thomas Hartley lived on to a considerable age, becoming in time one of the most quietly respected figures throughout the entire county, known simply and affectionately by nearly everyone who had dealings with him as Honest Hartley. He eventually took over the print shop entirely upon old Fenwick's eventual retirement, expanding it steadily into a modest but well-regarded business that continued to serve the town faithfully for many years, and he helped personally to found and maintain the very school he had once requested be built with the magistrates' reward money, visiting it often in his later years to speak with the children and to check upon their progress. In his later years, when younger apprentices and curious townsfolk alike would ask him how he had managed to remain so consistently honest through so very many difficult trials, when dishonesty had so often promised him an easier and more immediate reward, he would tell them, patiently and without any trace of pride, what he had come to understand across the whole long course of his life. Honesty, he would say, settling back in his chair with the unhurried manner of a man who had long since made his peace with the world, is never a single grand and dramatic act performed once, gloriously, while all the world happens to be watching and admiring. It is instead 1,000 small, quiet, largely unremarkable choices made again and again when absolutely no one at all is watching, the coin returned when it might so easily have been kept without anyone ever the wiser, the plain truth spoken aloud when a comfortable lie would have served so much more easily, the tempting purse politely refused when that refusal cost something genuinely dear to give up. Wait, he would caution them gently, to practice honesty only in matters of great and obvious consequence, and you will most surely find that you have already, quite unknowingly, practiced dishonesty 100 times over in all the smaller, seemingly insignificant matters along the way, and that long, comfortable habit of small deceptions will inevitably betray you precisely when it matters most, when the stakes are finally too high to bear the cost of your own compromised character. He had learned, too, he would tell them, settling into the deeper wisdom of his advanced years, that justice entirely without mercy inevitably curdles over time into something closely resembling simple cruelty, just as mercy entirely without justice just as surely dissolves into a kind of dangerous weakness that helps no one in the end, least of all those who might genuinely benefit from proper correction. When those who had wronged him so grievously stood at last exposed and utterly helpless before him, stripped of all their former power to harm him further, he had found, to his own quiet surprise, no true satisfaction whatsoever in seeing them utterly and completely destroyed. True justice, he had come to believe firmly, seeks always to correct a genuine wrong and to prevent its repetition in the future, not merely to answer one person's suffering with an equal or greater measure of suffering visited upon another. And he had learned, finally, perhaps the hardest lesson of all, that silence in the face of clear and obvious wrongdoing is itself, in its own quiet way, a form of dishonesty every bit as real as any spoken lie. It would have been so very easy, many times throughout his long life, simply to look away from another man's fraud or cruelty and tell himself comfortably that it was none of his particular affair to address. But a man who plainly sees corruption unfolding before him and chooses to say nothing at all has, in the deepest and truest sense, already quietly agreed to it in his own heart, whatever he might later claim to himself in his own defense. Long after Thomas Hartley had finally passed peacefully from this world, full of years and quietly mourned throughout the whole county, the small school he had helped to found continued faithfully to teach Thornbury's children their letters and their sums for many generations afterward, and above its humble door, carved carefully into the gray stone lintel by his own explicit instruction, were words he himself had chosen many years before as his final and most lasting message to those who would come after him, that a man's given word is the one true coin that never loses its value nor its worth, so long as he never once spends it falsely. And that simple, unadorned truth was, in the very end, the whole of what his long and honest life had ever truly tried to say.